Welcome to Anita the Pedagogue channel. Today I want us to look at poetry analysis. We are going to do a continuation of our analysis on the poem Meeting Break by Irish poet Seamus Heaney. This is a part 2 version. There is already a part 1 version on this channel. So let's begin. For our objectives for today, we will quickly do a recap of what we did in the part 1. In the part 1, we looked at a biography of our poet Seamus Heaney. We looked at the structure of the poem. I read out the poem. We looked at the title and why that title was used. And also, we looked at the meaning of the poem, its analysis from stanza 1 to stanza 7. So we continue today. We'll look at Meeting Break as an elegy, and we will look at some of the literary devices. We'll also look at the themes that can be deduced from the poem Meeting Break. Now let's look at Meeting Break as an elegy. What is an elegy? An elegy is a sad poem written to express sorrow for someone who is dead, usually someone you have loved. The purpose of this kind of poem is to express feelings and emotions. Even though the speaker in the poem Meeting Break does not focus much on his own feelings and emotions, he rather speaks about what the rest of his family feel about the death of the child. We see this in line 4 when he says, "I met my father crying." He tells us about the feelings of his father. And in line 9 and in line 8 and 9, he says, "I was embarrassed by old men standing up to shake my hand." So here he talks about his own experience, about how he felt about the burial of his younger brother. Again, we see in line 13, "Coughed out angry tearless sighs." This expression was what his mother went through, and so he explains exactly how his mother felt. And so Meeting Break can be said as an elegy because it is a poem that was written concerning the burial of the speaker, the burial of the brother of the speaker, and it expresses sorrow, feelings and experiences as a result of the death of that loved one. Let's move on and look at some literary devices. We begin with symbols. Now when we talk about symbols, it is used by poets to tell us that there is a deeper meaning for a word or an expression that they have used. Let's take a look at the expression "a 4-foot box, a foot for every year" in line 22. The use of 4-foot box, a foot for every year, is a symbol which represents the brevity of the child's life, in that the child was just 4 years old. So a 4-foot box, a foot for every year. Again, the use of the word knelling of bells, as we see in line 2, the word knelling represents a burial or funeral, as it is a solemn sound that represents death and funerals. Again, the use of poppy brews. Poppy, as used in line 19, could signify death, sleep, bloodshed, or even peace. It also represents remembrance. So, poppy brews, as used here, is to signify the death of the child. We move on to the use of the literary device Asanas. An Asanas is a literary device whereby the vowel sound is repeated in words. So in line 22, we have the expression a four, you see the O sound, foot box, a foot for every year. So the vowel sound O has been repeated severally, and so it is one use of Asanas, and it has been used to show emphasis to this particular line. Again, the use of alliteration. Now, alliteration is the repetition of consonant sounds in words. So the consonant sound has been repeated again in line 22. We see it in a 4-foot box, a foot for every year. Now line 22 actually is the last line of the poem Meet and Break, and it serves as a summary of the entire poem. And so we see these devices being used to show a lot of emphasis. We continue to look at the literary devices. The literary device onomatopoeia, and it is a literary device whereby a word is used to imitate natural sounds of things. So we see this in line 2 when the word knelling has been used, and it is the sound of solemn bells knelling. We want to take a look at another literary device, which is repetition. Now, repetition is when a word or a phrase is repeated. Again, in line 22, we see the word foot being repeated. A 4-foot box, a foot for every year. The word foot has been repeated twice. We move on to look at metaphor. Now, a metaphor compares two things without the use of as, like, or than. In line 19, we see wearing a poppy bruise on his left temple. Now, we see that poppy bruise is comparing the wound on his left temple. So, the poet uses poppy bruise to show how the wound on his left temple looked like. And so, there is the use of metaphor. Again, we move on to literary devices, and there is the use of enjambment and end stop. Now, enjambment means moving one line, an idea from one line to another without a pause or a punctuation mark. And there are some lines where there are dashes and full stops, and these are end stops. So, when you look at enjambment, lines 4 to 6 are end stopped, and so they encourage the reader to pause and reflect, whilst lines 7 to 9 are all enjambed. And with these lines, the poet seems to have rushed to the tragedy of the death of the child. We move on to look at imagery. And imagery consists of descriptive language that allows the reader to imagine or experience the 5 senses through the use of words and expressions. And the 5 senses are our sense of sight, smell, taste, hearing, and touch. So in line 19, the use of wearing a poppy bruise on his left temple appeals to our sense of sight, in that it allows you to picture how the bruise on his left temple looks like. Again, in line 2, counting bells nailing classes to a close appeals to the sense of hearing. Why? Because the word nailing shows that there is a bell sounding. We move on to our next literary device, which is euphemism. And euphemism refers to a polite or pleasant use of words and expressions to replace words or phrases which are usually considered harsh, impolite, or unpleasant. So in line 10, the use of sorry for my trouble. Sorry for my trouble here represents the death of the loved one. So the trouble here is the death of the loved one. And not wanting to use the word death since it looks a bit harsh, the poet decided to use trouble instead. Again, in line 20, the use of the 4-foot box. The 4-foot box here represents a coffin. And here again, our poet used euphemism because instead of using the word coffin, in some cases casket, decided to use a box, that is a 4-foot box. And so there is the use of euphemism. We move on to the use of rhyme. Now what is rhyme? It is the repetition of the same or similar sounds in 2 or more words. Here again, when we look at line 21 and 22 of the poem Midterm Break, you would realize that line 21 ends with clear and 22 ends with year. And these 2 words have a similar sound. And so it is the use of rhyme. And this line also shows that the poem has ended. That's line 22. Okay, we'll go on and progress and look at the themes. Now, when we talk about themes in literature, we are talking about the central idea of the poem. What is the key thing that the poet wants you to take note in this particular poem? So, one, we have the theme of death. And this poem lets us in on the experiences of a young boy who experiences the death of a loved one for the first time. He himself experiences isolation as he sits alone at the Calistic Bay. He also experiences the effects the death of his young brother had on her mother, who coughed out angry, tearless sighs, and his father, whom he met crying. And so the theme of death is one that is quite prominent in the poem Midterm Break, as the totality of the poem talks about the burial of a child, a 4-year-old child. We move on to another theme, which is mourning or grief. The poem projects the grief that accompanies the death of a loved one. It also shows how the neighbors and the community support the bereaved. And some examples from the poem that shows or that highlights this particular theme is 1. Neighbors drove me home. So when somebody is bereaved, neighbors and community members come around to support that person in any way they can, since it is a difficult time for them. Also, old men standing up to shake my hand. Again, when somebody is bereaved or loses a loved one, we have the community members, relatives and friends coming to extend their condolences and also to encourage. And they tell me they were sorry for my trouble. So here again, they come as a support group to encourage and give hope to those who have lost their loved one. All these expressions from the poem shows how the bereaved get support when there is a loss of a loved one. And this brings us to the end of our lesson on midterm break. I hope this lesson was very useful to you. Please put in your comments and questions and I'll respond to them. Do like, share and subscribe to this channel. Until I come your way again, keep learning and be the best version of yourself.